Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are lucky to have Niko and Louis joining us to talk about solar grazing. Just so you know, on Zoom, we're going to ask everybody to stay muted at this point and put your questions in the chat box. And then at the end, we're going to open it up. I think there's few enough people that we can have people raise their hand. I can unpin us so everybody shows up on the screen and we can actually ask questions live. So feel free to jot stuff in the chat box though, if you want to so we don't forget something. So I'm going to introduce, Niko's going to go first. Niko's, I don't know what your official title is at Cornell anymore, but I think she's a postdoc at Cornell.
Yes, that's correct.
And also has a sheep farm, much like the rest of us. And I'm going to let you tell a little bit about your farm, Niko.
All right, great. Thank you, Betsy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see? Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, so as Betsy said, I'm a postdoc in the animal science department at Cornell. And yeah, together with Louis, we have a sheep farm, Taconic and Sheep LLC, and yeah, so we're located right now in Vermont. And yeah, Louis, do you want to maybe introduce yourself right away as well?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Louis Fox, like Niko said, we are sheep producers. We're located in the Champlain Valley, Vermont, around Middlebury. I grew up here. I ended up in New York for about 10 years and was in the dairy industry and grew up on a dairy farm. My family still operates it here. And in 2018, we got interested in sheep production. Niko has a background in sheep production, and we had the opportunity to rent a retired dairy farm in New York. So it was a tie stall barn, about 50 acres of pasture that went with it, and we bought 2 flock dispersals, and we started with about 70 sheep and rented facilities, and we bought feed and we sold lambs. And so that's kind of the start of the sheep enterprise. And then that same year, like I'll talk about a little later in the presentation, we started grazing solar sites. So I got connected with Lexi Hain, who is the executive director of the American Solar Grazing Association. And she was just getting started grazing solar sites. And we ended up kind of collaborating on a grazing contract together, and we've formed Agrivoltaic Solutions LLC, which is a grazing business. And like I said, I'll talk about that after Niko goes. So we've got the sheep farm and we graze solar sites.
All right. Yeah, so I'm just going to get started telling you a little bit more about our farm. So as Louis said, we started in 2018 with 70 katan ewes in Cortland, New York. I was at that time a PhD student in the animal science department and getting ready to write my dissertation. And yeah, so that's where we got started. And this summer, 2021, we relocated the entire operation, our flock of 400 ewes. So we grew quite a bit over the past 3 years, and we relocated to Leicester, Vermont, close to the property of Louis's parents. And that's where we're based out of right now. And yeah, we do meat production and custom grazing on solar sites. And the way we sell our lambs is as feeder lambs and also for market lamb production. And when we sell feeder lambs, we have a couple customers that actually graze solar sites with those lambs, right? So we sell them, let's say 80, 100, 120 ram lambs, and they will pick them up at the mid-May, maybe beginning of June, and then stock a solar site in their area with those ram lambs and grow them out until they go to auction in the fall. And we also sell a small amount of market lambs every spring. We sort of try to limit that. We do prefer selling feeder lambs compared to the auction, and because that means for us that we can plan, right? We can sort of project into the new year. We know our customers well in advance, and we sort of have that security that we will be able to actually sell our lambs. That has worked very well for us right now, and I think it's especially important right now as we're still growing, right? We're planning on getting up to close to 600 ewes next year, and then we'll just see how it goes after that. Yeah, we do not retain any ram lambs that we graze on the property or grow out throughout the season. So we really only keep our replacement ewes. That are the only animals aside from our flock that we retain, and that's actually, so the pictures here, this is in Cortland, New York. I think that was 2 years ago in winter. So we grazed well into the fall, and we only moved into the barn, let's say December 15th or something, when all the grass is gone. And this over here is in Vermont. That's our flock of retained replacement ewe lambs. And that was last fall, or last summer, actually. I think that's August in Vermont. Yeah, and our lambing season is coming right up. We usually start in February. So this year we start February 1st, and then we lamb for 6 weeks until March 15th. And we usually try, not this year, but usually we try to do it staggered a little bit and to breed our ewe lambs a little later than the ewes for a variety of reasons. This year they will lamb all together. Yeah, and just a little bit our yearly flock timeline. In May 1st, that's always like the time that we're aiming for, is when our grazing season starts. And our grazing season starts usually with a group of ewes moving out to a solar site to start their yearly, or grazing season rotation. And then May 15th, that's our goal, to have all our ram lambs sold as either feeders or at auction. And then on May 15th, our replacement ewe lambs, so like the lambs that we keep back to like grow our flock, they start a separate grazing rotation. So what I mean by that is we do not graze our ewe lambs together with our mature ewes, and that has the reason that we have a very good experience with that. It keeps the parasite load very, very low for these ewe lambs, and they just grow significantly better. We keep them on the farm or close to home so that we can move them every day. We rotationally graze them. We move them every day. We supplement grain a little bit, and they just get managed very intensively, and that just works better when they're closer at home and not away on a solar site. And then in September 15th, that's the next milestone. That's when breeding starts, and we breed separate groups. So we have our replacement ewes and our flock, our ewes, and we use separate rams for that to avoid inbreeding, of course. And then once breeding is over, they then get combined into one flock after breeding, and that coincides most of the years with the time point when they move back to more local pastures now in Vermont and start their fall grazing. So we try to really move them off of solar sites at October 15th, something like that. And yeah, and then in December 1st, December 15th, sometimes a little bit later, even really depends on the year, we move to the barn. They go on first cut haylage, and then January 1st, maybe 15th, depending on when lambing starts, they move onto better feed, which for us is most of the time second cut haylage. And then lambing starts for about 6 weeks. And after lambing, we creep feed our lambs so they get quite a bit of grain, and get their CD&T shots, get checked for worms regularly, and then May 1st, the grazing season starts again. Just a little bit to our flock management strategy. So this right here is our current facility we're renting. So we do not have our own sheep barn yet. That is a little bit in the future, maybe next year, hopefully. but it works really well for us to rent facilities, worked well in Cortland, same thing now in Vermont. So we have this coverall barn, also an older dairy barn facility that we were able to rent that is close by. And yeah, as you can see, we feed baleage here in these big round bale feeders. We have 4 of them. That seems to work really well as long as they don't run out of feed. And this right here is one of our portable chute systems. This is very important for us, also for the solar sites, and I'll get into that a little bit more. And right here you can see our hoof bath. So we do struggle because we bought in from a variety of different farms. We do struggle a little bit in the fall with scald, foot scald. So we try to really, in the winter when they come into the barn, we try to hoof bathe them quite a bit so that they keep their feet healthy. And this is right here. We also do our flock inventory there after they move into the barn, pick our cull ewes, etc. And that system really works well for us. And yeah, and we also try to sort into close-up groups during lambing, right? So whoever has the fullest udder moves into the close-up group, and that sort of limits a little bit how much we have to check them or where we have to check them in the barn during lambing. And then in the summer, we bring the system out to the solar sites and use it there. We do very frequent FAMACHA scoring, 5-point checks. We try to do that every 6 weeks just to keep the parasites under control. And then if necessary, and we're actually really, really good. So for the past 2 years, we've been very successful with our internal parasite management. So we don't deworm a lot, and we deworm individually only if necessary. But that is like a cornerstone of our management strategy to really make sure that they're parasite free and thriving. We have the possibility or the opportunity to do a foot bath on site if we have to. We try not to do that. We really try to get them on site without scald issues, but sometimes when it's really wet and muddy, then there's a little bit of a flare up, and then we run a foot bath. That works also really well. And we do our sorting, for example, for cull ewes or et cetera, where we can also handle them very well on site. And yeah, just maybe a little bit about challenges and opportunities that we face. So of course on farm, right, or for us, we do have less control over our flock in the grazing season there. We have less eyes on the flock, right? They're in the solar site, and sure, they get checked 3 times a week, and we lay eyes on them, or Lewis does, right? But it's not as intensive as when you graze them on your farm and you actually move them, rotationally, or graze them rotationally, move them every day, and you can really get a really close look. So that is sometimes, for me at least personally, a little bit stressful because I don't always feel 100% in control, right? And I have to rely on these flock management strategies, like, yes, every 6 weeks we FAMACHA score, we look at their body condition scores, we treat anyone that has an issue, maybe feet or maybe worms, but again, it's a little bit less in my control, and sometimes that can be an issue, right? The mileage is also something that comes with the territory, and Lewis will talk about that in detail. So it doesn't really matter if you stock, let's say you graze 3 different solar sites, right? It doesn't matter if you stock each of those sites appropriately and then check each of those sites every week, or if you drive them from site to site, right? And you have a grazing rotation among these 3 sites. Either way, you end up with quite a bit of driving, and the mileage does add up, and the time that goes into it also adds up. And yeah, maybe a little bit later, we could also talk about strategies of how to move these sheep, right? Do you have a trailer? Like, we own our own trailer, but there's also opportunities to truck for hire, or to find trucking businesses who will do that for you for hire. Yeah. And then a very, very important thing is that I feel like we've only gotten really good at this year, is to have a chute system that really works, that is portable and that is efficient, that's easy to collapse, easy to put back up, that's sturdy, that doesn't, you know, fall over, that is really, yeah, a good chute system to be able to perform flock management tasks and like work your flock efficiently. So that's a challenge. And then water management, very few sites have a well access, so there's quite a bit of water trucking. So that can also be a challenge. However, for us, at least, the opportunities by far outweigh the challenges. We grazed 125 acres of solar in 2021, right? That is a big increase in our farm income. With that, our farm viability increased, and we really had the opportunity, or have continuously the opportunity, to grow. And yeah, and a big one is also that flock expansion is possible, right? We can grow our flock because we do not have to graze them on the home farm. We bring them somewhere else to graze. We can make hay on the acres that we do own, and as long as the winter barn facility is available, we can really, yeah, or it is possible to grow the flock. And yeah, maybe a little plug for the research that I've done at Cornell. We published, the late Mike Tony and I together, we published a couple of papers on that, the last one in 2021 and then one from 2019, that both look a little bit at opportunities, challenges after solar grazing industry. One in New York State, and then another one is really a study that we did in 2018 in Musgrave on solar grazing. So those may be worth reading to you. Overall, the opportunities that we found, yes, it increases farm income and farm viability. It's super possible to have successful vegetation and flock management on those sites. It works, right? And it lowers the barrier of entries for younger farmers, for beginning farmers, for folks that want to get started in agriculture. And with that, it contributes to the growth of the New York State sheep industry, which definitely is a plus. Challenges that come with that is, and we all are probably intimately familiar with that, slaughterhouse capacity is an issue, right? There's not many, sadly, not many opportunities for slaughter available. Slaughterhouses are booked up. Land marketing with that can be a little bit tricky, especially when the flock is growing, right? And then, yeah, what comes with the territory, again, is the distance to the home farm and the mileage driven. Just very briefly, outlook. Back in 2019, there was about 300 acres of solar grazed in New York State. We are up to 2,000 acres total, approximately in 2021, right? And from that top publication here, where we looked at the growth of the industry in the coming, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, we could very well end up with 130,000 acres of solar by 2035, right? When all these utility solar sites are moving in. Yeah, and with that, and if there are not any specific flock questions, I could just maybe turn it over to Lewis and yeah, to talk a little bit more about grazing solar sites, contract grazing land that is owned by solar developers, contractual details, and a little bit more to nitty-gritty.
Niko, there was one question about, do you make your own forages or buy your own forages?
So currently, so the plan is in the future to make our own hay. However, we just got here and it's been a little a little much. And I think for the next probably 2 years, and last year, same thing, we had hay made by a contractor on our land, right? So they came in, we mowed it, or Lewis mowed it, and raked it, and then they came in and baled it and wrapped it. So yeah, but in the future, that's one of our future goals.
You have enough land to keep growing?
Owned, not, but there's ample availability of land to rent here. So I think we'll be fine.
And there's another question here about growing from your initial 70 sheep. Did you acquire additional sheep or grow your own?
So we retained everyone that we could justifiably retain, right? So any lamb that we could retain, we did retain. And we did buy a limited amount of sheep, I think maybe 80 in total, and the rest, not entirely sure about the numbers, maybe 100. Yeah, so we did continuously buy in a little bit. We stopped doing that. We're not doing that going forward because of biosecurity. But up until last year, I think we bought our last ewe lamb flock. That was 40 ewe lambs, yeah, that we bought in.
So Rich Toby has a question, which makes me smile because I've famached big groups of sheep, but how do you efficiently famacha so many sheep?
You just do it.
Well, I was looking at your handling setup has like a metal, looked like a metal box on the end. What was that?
Oh, that's just a gate.
Just
It's just a gate. Yeah. So the trick is, and I can go back to that. The trick is to have it very long, right?
Right, so you have a lot of them lined up in there.
Exactly. And ideally there will be another one, right? And then to really have them close together. So in here, we fit 7 sheep in line, right? And then you can really, they have their heads up, and if you are practiced, which we are at this point, it goes very, very fast. And then also I have to say, right, I mean, if you famacha score the first 100 and there's nothing, and you find
Right.
very, very good scores, you may not end up doing them all, right? You may end up doing the ones that have a low body condition score, or that have a mucky butt, or have something else that's going on with them, right? And then conversely, if there's a lot of parasite pressure and you know that, and you famached like 50 and 10 of them were a little low, then you'll end up doing everyone. But I mean, those days are long, sure, that takes a day. But I think for us, if we put in that work, the return on investment is very high because we have healthy sheep.
Right, saves you a lot later.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, great. That's all the questions in the chat at the moment.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a little more in detail on the solar grazing side, and the grazing business that I'm a partner in is agrivoltaic solutions. And so we started this the same year we got sheep. And so the grazing business is myself and Lexi Hain. We shared a contract on a solar site together in 2018. And I was a little apprehensive about grazing sheep on a site. It was about 45 minutes away. It was a Cornell-owned site. And that's kind of where we got our start. And I was a little apprehensive about the time that we were going to put in, and how the animal performance and well-being would be with the sheep being farther away, and having a little bit less management intensity. And so it ended up going very well. The sheep did well. The site was managed well. We hit the vegetation targets that we needed to, and we were paid, and so it was a good experience. And we said, okay, well, let's see if we can just keep going with this and see what the market is. And so the markets turned out to be very good. As many of you may know, there's the floodgates are kind of open right now in New York and in a lot of parts of the country for solar development. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of activity in the development side of solar. We've seen a lot of solar built in New York. Right now, most of the sites, well, really all of the sites that we graze are more or less what you would call community scale sites. So our average site is in the 20-acre range. So we had around 25 facilities last year under our management, and it was with 9 different companies. The largest site that we grazed is in southern Pennsylvania. It was about 150-acre site. That would be considered a utility scale site, really. In New York in the future, there will be more sites like that one and larger. Right now, the market is primarily what you'd call community scale. So in the smallest site we do is about 3 acres, and the largest in New York is around 50 acres. So that's kind of the scale we're talking about. And there's a lot of activity going on with that. And so I think we're really starting to see the beginning of the wave of that development. And the grazing industry, if you will, is catching up with that. So we've seen more and more people be interested in this business and start to work with grazing, managed grazing on solar sites. It's still, really what you would call in its infancy. And there's a lot of opportunity. And I think really there's going to be more than enough opportunity for anybody who wants to turn this into a business and do a good job and build relationships with different firms. It's very doable. There's considerations about, how much time you put into it and kind of what kind of a business you want it to be. But it's a very good opportunity, especially for somebody who may be getting started with livestock and wants to build some equity in animals and add an enterprise, with those animals. This may work very well for that. So Niko and my sheep were on about 8 different sites in 2021. So we'll see a little bit down the road here. I'll talk about the different ways that we graze sites. We work with some partner farms that subcontract some sites, and we lease some flocks. And then we have a significant amount of our own sheep on solar sites. Many of the sites that we graze, we will have grouped geographically, and we'll take a larger flock and move it amongst the sites. So for instance, right now we're grazing, a little bit in Pennsylvania. Most of it is in New York. And then we have a little bit of a footprint in Vermont. So we're located in Vermont now. We'd like to build a business, more in Eastern New York and Vermont. But last year we had 4 sites in Vermont. And so we had one group of sheep that was moved between those sites, and we stocked. That group was sized to be able to cover all of those sites basically in 60 days or so. And so we have them on a site, for a couple weeks, and then load them up and move them to another site, and so on and so forth. That's how we do a lot of our sites. The trade-off is that it's more animal moving and animal trucking, but it's also a little easier in that you don't have sheep on so many sites at once. So this year we're going to add more sites with a set number of sheep on the site for a larger part of the season. We're doing that with some of the sites in New York. It's just because logistically it works a little better in that area. We see about 3 sheep an acre being, if you want to put a ballpark number on what will manage the vegetation on a site. It's in New York in the Northeast. It tends to be around 3 sheep an acre. There's a number of different factors that affect the stocking rate that you'll put on a site. There's a number of different factors. Some sites produce forage a lot better than others. Generally, they produce forage pretty well. So this is, generally we're targeting about 3 sheep an acre. Now that may look like 10 sheep an acre for a couple weeks and then off it for a long time, and then the sheep coming back. But over the whole season, if you're looking at the portfolio, that's about how many sheep we need, is about 3 an acre. Next slide. Okay, so when you have a site, a solar site that pops up, say down the road from you, if you're interested in grazing that site, one of the first things you're going to want to do, and one of the most important thing, is to figure out who you need to talk to and who you need to be dealing with to look into getting a contract to graze that site. So it can be complicated. Because there's a lot of different people involved, usually between permitting through development, construction, and then the overall site ownership. In most cases, the companies that are developing the solar don't own the land. It's a leasing arrangement. There may be a company that does the early development of the site and then sell it to a different company that'll actually build the site. And then in some cases, there will be a company that'll sell it to a long-term owner. So there may be some changing of hands of the site between the early development process through to the long-term ownership. So it can be tricky to figure out who you're dealing with. And, generally what you're aiming for is working with the long-term owner and whoever is handling the operations and maintenance of that site. So some developers and owners handle that in-house. Operations and maintenance kind of covers anything from groundskeeping and vegetation maintenance is what we do. Snow plowing, electrical contracting, and maintenance of the electrical equipment on the site. It could be tree work to, any trees that could fall on an exterior fence. It can be a lot of different things. So operations and maintenance is really who you're looking to get in touch with. Some companies, some site owners will contract with a separate firm to do operations and maintenance for a portfolio of sites. So the operations and maintenance company may be the same as the site owner, or it may be a separate firm that has that contract. So you may be working for the site owner, or you may be subcontracting to another operations and maintenance firm. So trying to parse that out and figure out who you're dealing with can be tricky. In general, this whole process takes patience. It takes some patience and some persistence. But if you keep working at it and keep, putting time in on the phone and reaching out, generally it's going to pay off. But the process from identifying a site and starting that conversation to actually getting animals on the site, it may take 2 or 3 years, depending on, what stage the site's at. So you really, if you think about it as a quick process, where you're going to, start now and have animals on this season, it's easy to get discouraged. So certainly having some persistence there is really key to the whole process. So, and just a little to step back a little bit, in New York, what we're doing here is a contracted service. So really, the business is similar to a landscaping business, where you're getting a contract to maintain vegetation within the site perimeter to a set height. The goal, obviously, in a solar facility is to minimize shading on the panels and minimize any overgrowth that could cause damage to the equipment on site. Depending on the facility and where it's located and what it's built on, mostly the vegetation is going to be standard pasture grasses. Often these sites are overseeded with a contract, like a typical contractor's mix, which can be various types of fescues, stuff that will grow fast and take quickly and easily. This may or may not be the most palatable for sheep in some cases. So, knowing what the site is seeded with and where it's built is certainly important to kind of look into beforehand. In New York, for a season of vegetation maintenance, we're seeing a lot of sites in the community scale. The contracts are, in the 250 to 500, 550 per acre per year range. There's outliers to this. We see a lot of it in this range. For larger sites, utility scale sites, this is probably going to be a little high. Those rates are going to be, because of scale, a little bit less than this. And it depends on the owner. It depends on a lot of factors. But this is kind of what we see for different people grazing in New York. This is, Cornell's done some of this research, and we know some of this from experience. So that's typically the range. And what that is going to be a season worth of maintenance. So you're looking at, May to October, basically, and everything that's needed to keep the site within compliance for that time. In terms of mowing, most sites in New York, you're looking at 2 to 3 mows per year. So we are also looking at grazing a site 2 to 3 times per year. That's really what it takes to do a good job with this. When you're looking into this business, it helps to think of it as a standalone business from your sheep farm. thinking about your business as, a vegetation management contractor is important to really be able to provide what the site owners are paying for. So, we usually let go of a little bit of sheep management intensity to be able to do a better job on the vegetation management side. So, you have to think of it as a little bit of a different business as, than solely sheep production, if that makes any sense. There's, a certain, regime of PPE is something that we do have to wear on site on most of these facilities. So in some cases, hard hats, generally reflective vests, obviously boots, long pants. So that's something that we have to think about. Site security is another one where, we will generally have a gate code or a gate key to have access to the facility, but facility security is very important with these projects. They need to have a secure fence, and you kind of need to be very careful about maintaining that, secure perimeter. So being very careful when you're going in or out, making sure that the gate is closed and secured after you leave. Obviously also for, the grazing part of that is very important. Generally, we're going to be on a site 2 to 3 times per week while the sheep are there, checking on them. Like Niko mentioned, most of the sites that we graze, we're hauling water to. It's, usually that doesn't mean more trips than we would otherwise make to the site, but it means that we're having, we have a tank in the truck with water in it. So kind of thinking through those logistics. We do carry pretty heavy liability insurance doing this. Some firms would basically take what you would normally have for a commercial general policy for your farm insurance. Some firms want quite a bit more insurance than that. So depending on who you're working with, you just have to kind of work through those insurance requirements beforehand. But you may be covered with what you have for farm insurance. In some cases, you can take your farm insurance policy and add a landscaping rider. Some insurance companies will be able to do this for you, some won't. And then in some cases, you need a heavier, policy. For instance, we have a $5 million umbrella policy, as well as standard, 1 million, 2 million aggregate commercial general liability policy. So that's because of one firm that we work with that wanted that. So we have that for all of our activities. You may need to look at commercial auto insurance as well. Sometimes this is required. Generally, if you have somebody else haul your sheep to the site, you can have this waived. We've seen that as usually something that we can have as a workaround. But just as a heads up, that is something that's usually discussed. We're usually bringing sheep on to get 2 to 3 grazes a year. We're bringing sheep on in May. It's best to get them on as early as possible to start the first rotation, especially if you have a number of sites, you want to be able to work through the whole portfolio that you're managing. But obviously, because of the fact that we're working towards vegetation specifications, height specifications, we want to be sure that we start early to get ahead of the vegetation growth that we see in, late May and June. So getting through that part of the year is the most difficult. And then after that, usually you're kind of destocking a little bit. You have, you need less animals, through July, August when it gets dry. So we'll usually do, a pass in May and then a pass in July, and then we'll often bring the sheep back in September, October for a third go round, depending on the site. The sites can be very variable. Okay. So when you have your contact at the asset owner, the operations and maintenance contractor, whoever it may be, if you get to where you're talking about specific sites, the next thing to do is to go out and look at the site. None of the sites that our firm grazes currently are designed with sheep in mind. Typically, that's not a big deal. Most of these sites work fine, even if they weren't designed for sheep in mind, but there are some pretty key areas that you want to look at when you're first going to kind of assess a site. So water access, obviously you're bringing water out to these sites. So kind of figuring out where the nearest source of water that you can access is one of the big ones that we're looking at when we're quoting sites. So we're figuring out what our costs are. We're figuring out how far does water have to come to the site, and how much hauling is needed, how many miles and how many hours is going to be needed to service that site with water for the season. Probably the most important one for us is the perimeter fence. In general, we don't have issues with predators on solar sites. We've had one incident where we lost sheep to a predator on a site. That was a site that was built. There was a lot of it was a rolling pasture, and there ended up being quite a few gaps under the fence. We patched a lot of them before we put sheep on, but there was a couple spots that got missed, or they were just a little bit more than we decided to patch, and we lost some sheep. It was the first sheep we had out last year, May 2nd, and we lost some ewes to a coyote. Knock on wood, other than that, we've never had an issue. We had at the peak about 1,400 animals out last year on 25 sites, and other than that, we've never had an issue. I wouldn't confidently say that we'll never have another issue, but generally, if the perimeter fence is good, and when I say good, I mean you want to look that it comes as flush to the ground as possible. So you really want to be looking for gaps underneath the fence. If you have gaps underneath the fence, you're going to need to patch those. We use a hog panel. We just cut pieces out of a hog panel and zip tie them into the fence. That usually does a pretty good job. But, kind of looking at how that fence lays to the ground is very important. Also, the material it's made out of, we really like chain link fence. A lot of the sites are chain link. Obviously, it's very sturdy. Generally, good amount of tension on it. A pretty heavy gauge metal chain link is the best. We also want to see a tensioning wire along the bottom of that chain link fence, especially if it's a smaller gauge fence. And sometimes you'll see kind of a black poly coating on a chain link fence, and usually that's a smaller gauge fence. It's especially important that those fences have a tensioning wire around the bottom perimeter, because it can be flexible enough for something to push its way in or sheep to push their way out. We've seen both of those situations. So, kind of understanding the fence that you have is very important. Also, a fence that we're commonly seeing put in now is like an ag type, a woven wire type fence. So like a 4x4 square woven wire fence. Generally, these are pretty good fences because they're very high tension. But again, the thing to look at with those is checking for gaps underneath it. Generally, if there's some gaps, we'll patch them. The only time that we'll have to pass on a site is something that we've seen in the last year or two. Some towns are requiring a wildlife gap underneath the perimeter fence. So like a 5 or 6 inch gap built into the fence to allow small mammals or what have you to pass through. That's obviously an issue with sheep grazing. So maybe if a site's next door to you, sure. But if it's 2 hours away from you, we would prefer not to graze a site with that much gap in the fence. In some cases, we've put guard dogs on a site. That site that we had the coyote issues with last year, we had a guard dog out there for a good amount of the summer. That's something you have to clarify with the site owner and whoever's, in charge of operations there at the site. It depends on the site owner if, what the level of comfort is with that. So that's just something that you have to, take case by case. If you know that you're going to want to use a dog on a site, you're going to want to talk about that in the contract phase and kind of have that language in the contract. So it's not the middle of May and you just lost some animals and you're going back and trying to negotiate that on the phone. It's good to kind of think that through on the front end. So are the gates lined up? This has to do with sites that are broken into different chunks and different separately fenced sections, which we see sometimes, even with community scale. Sometimes you'll have separately fenced sections. Usually if you have separately fenced sections of a site, there may be access gates between two sections. And so it's especially helpful if you have to move sheep from one section to the next, you're going to be walking them. So if you have two gates that are across from each other, you can do that pretty easy. Some sites don't. We have some sites where we have to set up a lot of electronet because we end up having to walk sheep kind of from one side all the way around the site to get to the next section. So that's something to think about. Just think through animal movement on the front end. We're using portable electronet in the sites there. So, you know, some solar chargers and whatnot, just clear that in the contracting phase. Just, you know, make sure everybody's aware of what's going to be there on the site. For signage, we have signs, that metal signs that we put on the gates that say sheep grazing, please close the gates. That's a very important thing. If you're going to have electricians coming in and out and different site techs. So making sure that there's good visibility, that there are sheep in there. And when they come in and out, they have to close the gate after them. We've never had an issue with sheep escaping from a site because somebody left the gate open. We've had a couple somewhat close calls, but it's just something that we really pay a lot of attention to is communicating very well what's going on the site. Because if somebody's coming in to do work and you're not there, you know, they need to be aware of what's in the site and you know, making sure that gate is closed. We do have a one-page handout that we give to the company that also orients them to, you know, what's on the site and what the expectations are for their employees and stuff like that. So that's just another part of that. So the seed mix I talked about a little bit, you know, often we see a contractor's mix. We like to discourage that because, you know, the fescues, you know, there can be some palatability issues, toxicity issues. You know, often if you're able to work with a developer on the front end, a pretty simple pasture blend is pretty cost neutral to them. So they're concerned about obviously cost, and then also a seed mix that's going to take fast and take well, and they're not going to have issues with closing out their stormwater permit. So stuff like that is good to keep in mind if you're able to kind of have those conversations about seed mix. Okay. So the picture on the right, you see, this is a setup that we have at a lot of our sites, especially smaller sites. We'll have
Leslie.
A water cube that we can fill. And so we put this near the site gate. So if we do it right, we don't even have to drive into the site. We have a pump on a tank on the truck, and then we could just put the pipe in through the gap in the fence and fill the on-site tank without having to drive in, which can be, you know, some developers prefer you not drive in the sites as much as possible. So, so that feeds into a float tank. It's got a little float on it. You know, we can say anecdotally that, you know, these sites have a lot of shade. So we see the sheep drinking, you know, certainly half as much as they would in a normal, you know, open to the weather pasture. They drink a lot less, just because most of the days, like the hot days, most days they just spend, you know, the majority of the peak sunlight hours underneath the panels in the shade. So there's a lot of shade. They drink a lot less water. We provide minerals on the site, and that's about it. Water and minerals and frequent checks. And that's kind of our, you know, keep it simple, and we do very well with that. A lot of these sites are next to the road. A lot of these sites have, you know, a lot of visibility to the public. So if you have an animal die on the site, it needs to be removed, you know, ASAP. That animal needs to come out right away. That's not something where there's a lot of wiggle room. There can't be mortalities lying around on a site. You know, you have a lot of animals on the site, you know, through the season, it's likely somebody's gonna die, natural causes or whatever. So just keeping an eye on that when you're checking the sheep. But when we're there, we like to, you know, how many are there? Is, the right amount there? Is anybody looking sad? Just a general welfare check. We just want to, be aware of how they're doing while they're there. Obviously, how much feed is left, and kind of keeping an eye on that. So here's a picture of one of our dogs out on a site at the top there. That's something we do very rarely. Generally we don't have dogs on sites, but in that case, we did have a dog there for a good amount of the year. And you got to understand the kind of dog you have, and what, how they are with people and stuff. This is our dog Hetty, and she's, she'll sleep through most things. Thankfully not coyotes, but generally she's sleeping under a panel somewhere during the day, and there's not much interaction with people. She's very friendly. So, that's the only kind of dog you really want to have there, because there are people that are going to be coming in and out. Just as an aside, maintenance on the sites is, unless they're having issues, it's pretty limited. Usually once or twice a year, we'll have electrical techs in a site just for routine maintenance, and that's about it. Sometimes they'll be different. Sometimes there'll be somebody there flying a drone to check for hot spots on the panels. There can be different things going on, but generally it's pretty limited. So it's not like there's a lot of people in and out, but it does happen. On the bottom left, this is something that we do around the equipment pads. So, the sites will have concrete pads where they have their transformers and their electrical collection equipment. It looks like that. There'll be a concrete pad, some stone around it, and there'll be some equipment boxes on it. Usually they hum, like, especially if it's a sunny day, you can hear them. We fence these out, not so much for safety issues. We've never had sheep damage them. But the concrete will stay a little bit warmer at night or a little bit cooler during the day, and the sheep like to lie on it, and then they poop on it. And you can have complaints because of, if an electrician has to go in and work on something and they have to kneel in sheep manure, nobody wants to do that. So we fence the sheep out of these for that reason. So it's a very simple fence we just put T-posts in, and we put hog panels around it, and it works great. You just need just a barrier for the sheep, and then they won't go on it. Very important to note, though, that if you're going to be putting T-posts in on a solar site, it needs to be cleared with a site owner. So that's something that you need to run by them if you're going to be driving posts in the ground, because obviously there's a lot of buried electrical lines. So you need to say, I want to put this many posts in. They're going to go 8 inches deep, and they're going to be located here. And then you get the okay, and then you could do that. So just, having good communication, again, is very important for stuff like that. But generally that's something we do at the beginning. And then if we're grazing a site, we just leave it up. It's got a gate in it for them to access, and, we don't have to take it down and put it back up every season. The perimeter here and the last photo, we'll talk about that in a little bit. We generally contract the mowing outside of the site perimeter. So that's something that's part of a lot of our contracts. And that picture before there, that site had some perimeter plantings where there's some bushes you could see. This site, we didn't contract the perimeter. That was a Cornell experiment station. But it does have some bushes you can kind of see in there. So kind of, if you have a perimeter mowing contract, you have to understand what you're mowing and what you're not mowing, so you don't mow the bushes down too, because they may be very expensive to put in. So the way we do our contracts is we contract for a comprehensive vegetation management. And so what that means is that for the year, we guarantee that the vegetation will be maintained to the site specifications for the whole year. And our price includes anything that we need to do that. So generally we aim to do 95% or better of that with the sheep. And the way we do that is we understand how many sheep we have to put on the site to achieve that. In some cases, thistles may be an issue that the sheep, don't like to eat them, especially if you get on a site a little bit later than, right at the beginning, they won't eat those. There may be some species that they don't eat otherwise, depending on the site. We have a few sites that have some species that the sheep don't eat. So for those situations, and depending on what our rotation's like, we have the ability and the equipment to do some mechanical mowing as well. And sometimes it's just something that's a good tool to have in our tool chest, because we can say, okay, we're going to do a light mowing in August on that site, or that site has a thistle issue, we need to mow it once during the season or something like that. It's something we do from time to time. Otherwise, if you have a good, well vegetated site with good forage, usually walking around once or twice a year with a scythe and just nipping any weeds or thistles is sufficient to kind of cover what the sheep don't cover. But we do like to have that ability. And we also, like I said, a lot of the sites we contract the mowing of the perimeter. So we do that mechanically as well. We don't graze the sheep outside the perimeter fence. That's something that a lot of site owners or O&M contractors like to have one firm do all of the vegetation control. So if you're grazing it, they want you to also do the outside, because they don't want to have 2 or 3 different companies working to do that one job. So that's something to keep in mind. Even if you wanted to subcontract somebody to yourself and have somebody mow around the outside of the site. Sites that were cleared from woods often have brush issues. It's harder to get those sites seeded well so that you don't have saplings growing up and stuff like that. So that's something to really keep in mind when you're looking at a site, to understand kind of what may happen down the road. Some string trimming or a scythe, like I said, a couple times a year. Sometimes you're going to get asked if you can contract, say, snow plowing in the winter, or maybe a little bit of tree work around the outside. So like sometimes, it's good to know if you're interested in doing that work or not, because that might come up. And that's that. This is our sheep obviously on a solar site here. Yeah, so I guess if there's any questions.
I have a couple questions.
Yep.
Have you grazed both stationary panels and panels that move with the sun, or I guess they
Yes.
tilt?
Yes, we've grazed both kinds. We graze mostly fixed tilt. You could see in this picture, this is the type of racking. So the racking is what holds the panels off the ground. This is a type of racking that has 4 posts that go in the ground. So this is a racking that's harder to mow under. So this is, we graze a lot of sites like this. We also have grazed tracker sites, like you said, which follow the sun. Depending on the manufacturer of the trackers, some of those will have drive lines that go down through the site. Sheep are generally fine with this. I think I saw a little while ago, Julie Bishop was on. She grazes a lot of sites with trackers and kind of raised cabling and stuff like that. We have a little bit of experience with that as well. So any type of wiring system on the site that isn't buried, you just want to kind of, know where it is, and, know how high it is. And also when you're looking at a site, I didn't put that in the slide, but it's very important to look for loose wiring. So make sure that all the panel wiring is kind of tucked up tight to the panels, because sometimes the sheep will catch that and kind of pop a connector off.
So does your income that you get per acre cover your mileage, extra insurance, people that you need to contract with to mow the outside?
Yes.
I assume you're keeping track of that, but.
Yeah, it does. Some of the, obviously something like insurance is a fixed cost for us. So if we have to have a really hefty policy, it does make sense to try to look for a few different sites to graze, to kind of dilute that out.
Does your regular insurance company write the insurance for the solar panels also?
So we have a liability policy that covers our activities. Our policy doesn't actually cover the sheep themselves. It doesn't cover risk to the sheep, but it covers anything damage that we or the sheep or a mower may do to the site equipment. So it's general liability. And then we also have an umbrella, a $5 million umbrella policy that kind of covers that if the limits are exceeded, but we've never had an insurance claim. Generally, the sheep are going to be less risk of damage to the equipment than a mower would be. So we think it's much lower risk than mowing activities, but usually
agree, but
yeah.
I have heard of people having trouble getting insurance.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just say we use Lunzer Insurance. They're out of the Buffalo area. They've been great. They can write those policies. So if you're having trouble, shoot me an email and I'd be happy to kind of help you point in the direction.
I think part of it's just because insurance companies didn't really know what was going on.
Yep.
So
Yep.
let's see, there's a question in the chat. Is there an expectation that the sheep clear mow 2 to 3 times a season, or is there flexibility where the sheep can be managed such that they are rotationally grazed on a single site throughout the year?
So it's a great question. It all comes down to kind of your communication and making sure everybody's on the same page as far as you and the company that you're contracting with. We usually just say that, I mean, you don't expect it to look like a golf course. Sheep will mow pretty clean usually if you have them, rotated in a certain way. But it's going to look different than a clean mow. So we write into our contracts that we just have the flexibility to manage the sheep as we wish, as long as the vegetation doesn't exceed the leading edge of the panel. And so that's basically what we work to. So on some sites, the leading edge of the panels are like 18 inches. That's a more challenging site to manage than a site where the leading edge is 3 feet. So newer sites tend to be built a little bit higher because it makes more sense from a lot of different ways. If you own a site, it just makes, snow falls off a better, so the newer sites typically are built a little higher, and we just have in our contract that we're maintaining the vegetation below that. And then we try to have as much leeway as we can to manage the site as we wish.
That's really low, 18 inches. Phew.
It's pretty low. You have about 10 minutes in the spring before it gets shaded. So
And the sheep really enjoy the shade under the panels, though.
They
I'm guessing
do.
in the summer.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing the grass grows under there.
The grass
but it's
does grow
hot.
under there. Yeah, it's interesting. We usually just see less of a forage drop off. And I'm sure Niko's research would kind of be able to tell that in more detail, but we usually feel there's less of a forage drop off in like July and August because it holds a little bit more moisture.
We have another question in the chat. Can you theoretically make hay on any of your solar sites as a method of vegetation management? Because the photo you're showing looks pretty wide, like you could fit a tractor.
Yeah, that site has that gap between those power blocks or those groups of panels where you could make hay. That's something you got to work it out with the site owner. There's cases we're going to, I think, see more cases with larger sites in New York, like utility scale sites, where there may be opportunities for that. And there may be interest in that as a form of agricultural co-location. So I think there are cases where that may be possible, maybe encouraged. We know some people who do this. There's some folks in Ontario, Shady Creek lamb. They graze some EDF sites up there. They have made hay between the panels as a strategy for managing vegetation and making feed for themselves. Obviously, this is more of a risk for the panels because you're using, bigger equipment in a tighter space. So, everybody has to be on board and understand what's going on and understand the risk, but it has been done successfully and it'll probably be done, we'll see it done again, I'm sure.
There's another question for you. Are the connections from row to row buried on your sites or above ground? It says they appear to be buried in the photos, but they've heard various receptiveness from developers and willingness to bury lines or not. Of course, let's see, it says, of course, it is an increased cost to bury them, but much more friendly for moving through.
Yep. We graze both kinds. So most of the sites that we graze, the lines are buried. We're seeing more sites built with raised cabling. It's usually it's called cab cabling in a lot of cases, or there may be cable trays, which are a little bit different, but similar. Generally, the sheep have no issue with it. They're pretty heavy cables. They're usually built pretty sturdy, and the sheep will pass underneath them. A site like that, you might want to limit your overall flock size. You might not want to put 1,000 sheep in a group with cabling like that, I would say. But generally, no problem with sheep. But we are seeing more sites that are built like that. So yeah, it's something we run across.
How about how long do contracts last? And have you ever had to get out of a contract?
We have mostly year-to-year contracts, and that, I think that's just a remnant of kind of how it works with landscapers as well. We have one 5-year contract. We're signing a 3-year contract on another site this year. But generally it's been year to year, and generally we haven't had any issues with getting the rug pulled out from under us. So a lot of that is just, you know, making sure you work to kind of build a good relationship with your customers, and, you know, do a good job and be professional, and, you know, make them want to hire you again. So we've had no issues with year-to-year contracts, and that does seem to be the norm right now. Although certainly I think larger projects, we're going to start to see more long-term contracts, I think, as this is developers and site owners get more comfortable with doing this.
Here's a good question. Are you grazing any large-scale solar sites, and how does your approach vary with larger projects like temporary fencing, longer grazing stay, or access?
Yep. We graze some, we've got a 150 acre site in southern Pennsylvania. That we have a partner farmer down there that has about I want to say 450 animals out there this year. So on that site, there's a permanent well there. So that's something you want to work out on a large site. So there's a permanent well, and there's a delivery line through the site. There's also going to be some permanent fencing in that site as well. Those sheep are going to stay. In that case, those sheep, and this is, I think, how it would probably work well with a larger site like that. In most cases, you have a flock of sheep in that site for the whole season, you know, because that many acres, once you know, it's pretty easy to plan for a rotation that's 6 weeks, and then you just start again. You know, so that's you would need a lot of sheep to be able to graze it in 2 weeks and then move to another site or somewhere else and then come back. So
Be nice if it was a long, thin array so you could like cross fence it.
it's sort of a long, thin array. It's built pretty well for grazing. Yeah, it's not 100% perfect, but it's built pretty well. So it went well the first year. This past year was the first year, and it went well. That was a site where there was that site, the sheep didn't go on until later in the season. They didn't go on until almost August, I think it was. So that's something you may see with newly built sites, where depending on when it's built, they may not have the construction phase closed out until maybe partway through the season. So maybe you're only getting on a site in like July or August, and the vegetation's already out of compliance, and it's very mature vegetation, and the sheep don't really like it. So that's the kind of case where you either put a lot of sheep on and trample as much as you can, or you're going to want to do some mowing. There's different ways to do it, but just kind of think about what the site is when you go in, and what you're going to have to do. So in that case, they had a mowing crew that was very overwhelmed. And so they ended up running the sheep through and grazing what the sheep liked. And obviously the mature stuff they left. So they grazed through, and then they mowed after them. And they could mow much faster once the sheep had grazed, you know, the more lush vegetation. So that's kind of how that worked out. You see there's a wood lambing on site, and may be a problem. There are people that lamb on solar sites, and I think they do it pretty successfully. That same outfit that makes hay on their site, they lamb on their site. We don't lamb on the sites. It's not something we like to do. A lot of our sites are farther away. We like to not have young lambs on a site either. You know, if it's farther away, it's very easy to get into a bad place with parasites before you're able to kind of manage around it. So we prefer to graze just dry ewes on our sites, or lambs that are grazed separately from mature animals. But, you know, with the right management, people do lamb sheep on solar sites and seem to do it successfully too.
Or even, I guess, if you could lamb just before, but I guess then you'd have to truck little lambs, which would be a challenge
Yeah,
for their mothers.
yeah.
Hmm.
So
Well,
that's part of
and
the reason we like to, lamb in February, March, is so that we can wean and then kind of have everybody separate by the time
Yep.
we're starting to graze.
easier to handle.
Yep.
We, St. Lawrence County has a huge transmission line running right through the middle of it. So we
Mhm.
have a lot of potential for solar sites. And I'm on the town planning board in Canton, and it's a little bit overwhelming how many solar sites are going in. So there's lots of opportunities. Some of the contractors are interested in sheep grazing, and some
Mhm.
don't really want to deal with it. So
It's interesting, I mean, a couple of years ago, you had a much harder time finding a site owner that was really willing to take the chance. But now that we have more people doing it, more people grazing, and generally, good experiences, and it works very well. So there's definitely more interest and more willingness to try it than there was a couple of years ago. So I think it really is starting to grow.
well, any more questions out there? We've been on here for quite a while. I really appreciate you and Niko taking time tonight to talk to us just before you get into your heavy lambing season. Hope that all goes really well. So I guess
Thanks
we're
for
all
having
set
us.
then.
Yeah, it was fun.
Thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
thank you
and
for having us.
It was great. It's really great to hear from people that are actually doing it in probably in 2 or 3 different places or more. So there's a few thank yous coming in the chat also. So we
Yeah,
appreciate it.
needless to say, if there's questions, please feel free to get in touch.
Okay, I'll send. Do you mind if I share your email when I send out the
No, please do.
recording?
I'll be fine.
Okay,
Yep.
we'll do that. Thanks a lot, and everybody have a great evening. If there's no more questions, we'll wrap it up.